Today, we're talking about hand sewing, which you're talking about in the lab right now. Mostly when we are making costumes, we rely on machine sewing. Mostly in modern clothing, we rely on machine sewing. But before we had sewing machines, and in what we refer to as haute couture, which is high fashion, there's more handwork. Handwork is more delicate, can work on more delicate fabrics, and takes a much longer time. So the more handwork that is involved in the clothing, the more expensive the clothing is going to be. There is almost always something that has to be done by hand. It might be as simple as a snap or hook and eye, or something a little more involved, such as a hem, the facings, or a trim that's put on the garment. So let's talk about needles. There are several different types of needles. And when you go to the store and you buy a package, you'll often get a package with a range of sizes in it. Hand sewing needles come in sizes from 1 to 24, with the most common and usable sizes being 8 through 12. You don't want a needle that's too small, and you don't want a needle that's too large. Because the whole point of the needle is it needs to go through the fabric. So let's start with sharps. Sharps, my favorite needle to sew with is an 11 sharp. Who thought I would ever be able to say, "Ooh, I have a favorite needle"? But I do. I have a favorite needle, the 11 sharp. It's the right size for my hand. And I like how sharp it is so that it goes very easily through the fabric. However, sometimes I might be working on a fabric that is knit rather than woven. A t-shirt is made out of a knit fabric. And you know, when you get a hole in something that is knit, it just gets bigger. So you want to use a needle that's not likely to make a hole, but is going to push the threads aside so it can pass through. And that would be a ballpoint needle. A ballpoint needle is the type of needle that you use when you are sewing on a knit fabric. And then halfway between the two, you have betweens. They're not super sharp, but they're also not a dull ballpoint. And those are also very common. Some other types of needles are denim needles, which are very heavy duty, that are made for creating jeans or working on twill or serge fabric. And then also leather needles. Now, leather needles look like a little knife blade on the end because they actually have to cut through the leather in order to go through to the other side. There is also a way that you can sharpen your own needles, or if you feel like they're getting dull, or if you feel like they have like a burr on the side of them that's catching on the fabric. If you've ever seen those little tomatoes that you can stick your needles into, your pins and needles into, there's usually a little strawberry attached to it. And that little strawberry is filled with emery sand. So like an emery board that you would use to file your nails. And if you stick your needle in and out of that strawberry several times, it will smooth and sharpen the tip of your needle. All right, once we have a needle, we have to have thread. Let's talk first about how we pick our thread. In the costume shop, we might be sewing on a red dress and then a green dress and then a blue dress. So we might have red thread and green thread and blue thread. When I was in graduate school, we didn't have any what we would refer to as colored thread. All of our thread was on the gray scale. We had black thread, we had white thread, and we had all the colors of gray in between. So if I was sewing on a navy blue dress, I would pick black or one of the darker grays close to black. If I was sewing on, say, a yellow or pink dress, I might not choose white, but I would choose one of the 4 lighter colors of gray. That's really a great way to think of saving money and to make your shop most efficient. But there are times when the audience is going to be close enough, such as working in film and television, or in a small theater where you're doing a decorative stitch and the audience isn't far, that you need to make sure that you're using a thread that matches exactly in color. But we call it choosing thread that is value specific, that it fits the grayscale of the fabric. Find it on the scale of light to dark, and then pick a thread that's most going to disappear on it. The other thing you need to think about is whether or not you have S twist or Z twist threads. Now, how did that develop? S twist is the twist that they got when they were using a spinning wheel to spin fibers together in order to make a thread. And it spins in a specific right direction. It goes towards the right side. And this is great if you are using an S twist thread to do hand sewing and you are right-handed. As you sew, the thread won't twist on itself. If you try to use a Z twist, as soon as you start sewing with your right hand, the thread's going to start to twist onto itself and make little knots. So why did they start making Z twist if the S twist is natural when you're using a spinning wheel? Well, the problem with S twist thread is when they invented the sewing machine, the way the sewing machine threads, it untwists S twist thread. And so they had to twist it the other direction. They manufactured Z twist thread specifically to put on a sewing machine. So when you try to hand sew with thread that is specifically for using on a sewing machine, it will automatically twist up on you and create little knots in your thread, which can be really annoying when you're sewing. Sometimes you have no other option than to use a Z twist thread. And we all do it all the time. We have that spool of thread that can go on the sewing machine, or you can sew by hand. So the trick is not to use a really long length of it. I like to say, never try to sew with a length of thread longer than your arm. Think about it. If you hold the fabric in one hand at your waist and you hold the needle in your other hand, you go through that fabric and then you pull away. Your hand can't pull away any further than the length of your arm. So you don't need thread any longer than the length of your arm. The longer your thread, the more knots you're going to get in it as you are working. Now, a lot of people worry about, Angela, you said use a small needle, but I can't see to get that thread through that little teeny tiny hole, or I can see it, I just can't make it happen. There are a couple of tricks to that. The first is that picture on the left with the red thread. Now that is blown up really, really big, but what you see is the thread is cut on a diagonal. That minuscule little piece of thread can be cut on a diagonal. And when you do that, it actually makes it easier to put through the eye of the needle. But some of us just have to give up. We are just never going to be able to thread that through the eye of the needle. They make a tool for that, and it is so easy. And there's nothing embarrassing about using a needle threader. In most little sewing kits, they look like a little dime almost. They've got that little Roman head on them, and they've got a little wire. They make them so they look like pink flowers. They make all kinds of different needle threaders, but then they've got this little wire off the bottom end. That wire is hard and stiff, so it is super easy to push through the eye of the needle. And then you have a big loop in which to put your thread, and then you just pull it right back through the eye of the needle. Now, if you've got a super, super tiny needle, you might have to wiggle it a little bit and work it through. But most of the time, you can just pull that right back through. You can do that when you're threading singly, which is the illustration here, when you want your thread to be doubled, and you can also sew with quadruple thread. I like to sew with quadruple thread when I need to sew a snap or a button on really fast, because that means 4 threads are going through every time I take a stitch. Okay, so there are some other tools. We've already talked about getting our needle through our fabric, but now we want our thread to pass through our fabric. And there's a really easy way to make that happen smoothly. And that's using beeswax or thread conditioner. And what you do is you lay your thread down on the beeswax, hold it in place with your thumb, and just pull it through. And it will coat your thread enough that your thread will now just smoothly glide between the fibers of your fabric. You can also buy pre-waxed thread. I like to use silamide, Rice's silamide. You'll find it in almost every costume shop. They sell it in a huge variety of colors, and it is specific for hand sewing. It is a very strong hand sewing thread that's been pre-waxed, and it also has a way that it can be pre-cut. So you can just pull out one thread at a time, and it's a little longer than half a yard. So it's almost perfect for everybody's one arm length. Again, the easier your needle passes through the fabric, the easier your thread passes through the fabric, the easier it's going to be to do the stitch that you need to do. Okay, different kinds of stitches. There are 3 basic types of hand stitching. The first is a temporary stitch, and an example of a temporary stitch is the basting stitch. We will use a basting stitch to hold something together until we see if it works, or instead of pinning something when we want to sew in the machine. So it's a stitch that you do, and then when you're done, you take it out. The second type of stitch is a permanent construction stitch. So those are stitches that we're not going to take out. An example would be doing a hand hem. We are doing that hand hem and we're not going to take it out. We're going to leave it for as long as it lasts. The third type of stitch is a decorative stitch. An example of that would be embroidery. Now, all of these stitches, you're going to learn a few in the lab for the class, but all of these stitches you can find in books, you can Google them, and on YouTube, you can watch videos about how to do them. There are wonderful videos out there made by several different companies that you can look at, and you could learn some extra stitches, or you might really learn that you love to do decorative stitches. I not only have a favorite needle to use, but I have a favorite hemming stitch. I can do the catch stitch very fast, and I find it to be a very strong, good stitch for holding hems. So that is my preferred hem stitch. You might find that the slanted hemming stitch itself is super easy for you, and you can do it fast. So we each have something that makes it easier for us to do. So you're going to do a couple of samples of hand stitching in the lab for the class. To thimble or not to thimble. When you've been hand sewing for a long time, you will find that the finger you push the needle through, even when it's going very smoothly through the fabric, but you tend to use your middle finger to push the back end of the needle all the way through so that you can pick it back up. And the tip of your finger will start to get a little sensitive. And so that is what a thimble is for. A thimble protects the tip of that finger. And there are lots of different kinds of thimbles, but they really just sit snugly on the tip of your finger. And you can use them. If you'll notice on the metal one, it's got little dots in it. Those little dots are where the back end of the needle sits. So it doesn't slide off the side and it goes through. I do find that particularly in Texas, when I have a metal thimble on, my finger will start to sweat and will slide around inside the thimble. So my preferred is the leather thimble, which is leather, but then it's got just a little pad of metal worked into it at the tip of the finger. I like that because even when your finger sweats in there, it actually just makes the leather mold to your finger more, which makes it more comfortable and it's not hard all the way around. The adjustable ring, I've heard people love it. I have never been able to make that work for me. So if the adjustable ring works for you, it obviously allows for the most breathability. But I really do recommend if you're sewing a lot by hand, you will find that a thimble is a lifesaver. Now, I know hand sewing takes some very specific motor skills, and some of you will excel at hand stitching, and some of you will survive hand stitching. And that is fine because that is part of that learning process. And so you see there, you see our tools. There's an image of the tomato with the strawberry attached that I was talking about for sharpening your needles. You see a thimble, and you also see in that piece of felt with the needles in it, there's our little dime shaped needle threader. Those are the tools that you're going to need in order to complete your hand stitching. Don't forget, you have a quiz coming up soon. All quizzes are open book, open note. If you've been taking notes with the questions that I have posed at the beginning of every video on the handout, you will be good to go when it comes to taking the quiz. Just look at those notes you wrote. All right, have a great day.